Hello, everybody, and welcome on into the Week 2 Fantasy Football Recap. Today, we will be discussing some injuries to players, players who did better than expected, players who underperformed, and players who surprised us, whether that be in a good or bad way. Let's start off with an injury update on some of fantasy football's biggest names. Dalvin Cook had to leave the game to get checked out by trainers 2 separate times, and the Vikings lost to the Cardinals. Mike Zimmer called it an ankle sprain for Cook, who has already had his fair share of injuries throughout his career. We should get an update on Cook's status for their Week 3 matchup against the Seattle Seahawks as we get closer to Sunday. Darrell Henderson suffered a rib injury that caused him to miss the entire fourth quarter. Henderson was having a productive day against the Colts, going for 13 rushes, 53 yards, and a touchdown on the ground while adding 3 receptions for 29 yards in the air. If Henderson were to miss time, Sony Michel would jump straight into that RB1 role for the Rams, but facing Tampa Bay's run defense doesn't seem like an ideal start to the year for Michel. Any 49ers running back that you could think of got hurt this Sunday in their win over the Eagles. Remember how everyone rushed to make Elijah Mitchell the top waiver priority? Well, he had a stinger to the shoulder on Sunday. The rookie that the 49ers drafted, Trey Sermon, he's currently in concussion protocol, and JaMycal Hasty is dealing with an ankle injury. Stingers naturally tend to heal the fastest, but we can see the recently acquired Trenton Cannon get work in the backfield if Sermon and Hasty are unavailable. 49ers fans are even calling for Deebo Samuel to become the team's running back on Twitter, so who knows what's really going to happen there. Deontay Johnson appeared to injure his leg on the last play of the game and the Steelers lost to the Raiders. There is no update on Deontay as of right now, but if he were to miss time, Juju and Claypool would see an uptick in their usage and James Washington could become the Steelers' wide receiver 3. 3 players who outperformed their projection this week were Derrick Henry, running back, Tennessee Titans. Henry, who posted 10.7 points week 1, put up 47.7 points in week 2 against the Seahawks. Not a bad way to bounce back, huh? Henry ran for 182 yards and 3 touchdowns on the ground and caught every pass that went his way, going for 6 receptions and 55 yards through the air. Those 6 targets this week were a career high for Henry. If they continue to utilize him in the passing game, we may be looking at the next overall RB1 in fantasy football. Aaron Jones, running back, Green Bay Packers. This time last week, we were talking about how much Aaron Jones had underperformed and how he had some fantasy owners panicking. No better way to make up for that than to drop a 41 bomb. Jones finished the week with 41.5 points, giving many people that Monday night miracle that they needed. Jones got a lot of his work from the receiving game, catching 6 passes for 48 yards and adding along 2 receiving touchdowns and 1 rushing touchdown. It is safe to say Aaron Jones is back on fantasy owners' good side. Cooper Kupp, wide receiver, Los Angeles Rams. Cooper Kupp seems like the Rams wide receiver you want in fantasy this year, already having a strong connection with new Rams quarterback Matthew Stafford. Kupp torched the Indianapolis Colts defense this week, going for 9 catches, 163 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Good enough to finish with 36.8 fantasy points. Kupp and the Rams will try to keep up this production against Tampa, who may be without both top corners again. 3 players who underperformed this week were Antonio Brown, wide receiver, Tampa Bay Bucks. A week after looking like his old self, Antonio Brown finished with only 1 catch for 17 yards, good for 2.7 points. All of AB's targets went to Mike Evans this week, and he made the most of them. The entire Tampa offense is full of question marks for fantasy because they are just so talented you never know whose week is going to be. Amari Cooper, wide receiver, Dallas Cowboys. Much like AB, Amari snapped off last week for 13 receptions, 139 yards, and 2 touchdowns on 16 targets. On Sunday, Amari caught 3 of 5 passes for 24 yards and 0 touchdowns, good for 5.4 fantasy points. With the Cowboys losing Gallup, I thought Amari could have routinely had those types of games like week 1, especially against the Chargers in a game that I thought would be a shootout. Amari gets a chance to bounce back against the Eagles on Monday Night Football, and I can only imagine how many matchups are going to come down to that game. Alvin Kamara, running back, New Orleans Saints. Kamara rushed the ball 8 times, going for 5 yards and no touchdowns on the ground, adding 4 catches for 25 yards through the air. Kamara's lack of rushing attempts was something that fantasy managers were probably not expecting going into this Carolina matchup. Even though they were trailing throughout the majority of the game, one would have still thought that Kamara would have gotten more touches, especially since he's the only guy that they have on offense. A couple of surprises from week 2 were Courtland Sutton, wide receiver, Denver Broncos. Somebody on that offense had to step up with Judy being out for 6 to 8 weeks, but I don't think any of us could have imagined this from Courtland Sutton. 1 week after looking like he still wasn't 100% coming back from that ACL, Sutton comes out and dominates the Jacksonville defense, albeit it was the Jacksonville defense. But the surprising thing was how he looked in that game. Sutton caught 9 of 12 targets for 159 yards, finishing with 24.9 fantasy points. Oh, and the receptions and yards, a career high for the Denver Bronco. With the Jets on the schedule for Week 3, there is no reason why Sutton shouldn't be able to replicate this performance. This commercial break is brought to you by ginger ale. Because when you have a cough that doesn't shut up, get yourself some ginger ale. George Kittle, tight end, San Francisco 49ers. For as high as Kittle was being drafted, he has failed to reach that game-changing type production throughout the first 2 weeks. Kittle finished the game with 4 receptions for 17 yards and no touchdowns. The good news for Kittle owners is he's got the Packers next week at home, the same Packers team who just gave up 17.1 fantasy points to undrafted free agent Juwan Johnson and 20.1 fantasy points to TJ Hawkinson. Henry Ruggs, wide receiver, Las Vegas Raiders. Henry Ruggs showed out against the Steelers defense, going for 5 receptions, 113 yards, and a touchdown, good for 22.5 fantasy points. Him and Derek Carr connected on a 61-yard touchdown in this game where Ruggs just flew right by the Steelers defenders. Ruggs has to be one of the most annoying players to own in fantasy football because of his high boom or bust potential. You never know when to play him because 1 week you'll get 6 points, but then the next week he'll put up a 20 bomb. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and so you can stay tuned for more weekly fantasy recaps every Wednesday.